The screams echoed across the Wyoming plains that October night in 1887, piercing the silence of the star-filled darkness like a blade through silk. But these weren't screams of pain or terror. They were the cries of new life entering the world, delivered by hands that had never held anything more delicate than a war bow, guided by ancient knowledge passed down through generations of Arapaho women who had birthed children under these same infinite skies, standing in that makeshift shelter of buffalo hide and cottonwood branches with a 19-year-old girl gripping his weathered hands as she brought her daughter into the world. Joseph Running Bear realized this moment would change everything he thought he knew about courage, honor, and the price of protecting the innocent. When the sun rose that morning, painting the grasslands in shades of gold and crimson, 2 lives had been saved, 1 life had been born, and the entire territory would soon be talking about the Arapaho, warrior who had defied both white man's law and tribal tradition to shelter. A runaway bride, whose only crime was refusing to marry a man 3 times her age. But the story that unfolded over the following months would prove to be about far more than a desperate escape and an unlikely alliance. It would expose corruption that reached from the roughest frontier settlements to the polished halls of territorial government, reveal secrets that powerful men had killed to protect, and ultimately force an entire community to choose between the comfort of accepted injustice and the dangerous path of doing what was right. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first gunshot shattered the pre-dawn silence, just as Sarah Elizabeth Coleman reached the banks of the Powder River, her swollen belly making every step across the uneven ground a test of determination and desperation. 8 months pregnant, and 3 days into her flight from Cheyenne, she had pushed herself beyond the limits of what any woman in her condition should attempt, driven by a terror that ran deeper than physical exhaustion or the growing pains that signaled her baby's imminent arrival. Behind her, perhaps 2 miles back along the cattle trail she'd been following since midnight, the voices of her pursuers carried on the crisp October air. Her father's voice, hoarse from 3 days of shouting her name across the Wyoming wilderness. The fainte, deeper, more menacing tones of Cornelius Hartwell, the 57-year-old cattle baron who had paid her father $1,200 for the right to call her his wife. And worst of all, the cold, professional efficiency of Marshal Todd Williams, whose badge gave legal authority to what Sarah knew was essentially a slave hunt. They were closing in, and she had nowhere left to run. Sarah had known this moment would come when she'd slipped out of her father's boarding house in the early hours of Tuesday morning, taking nothing but the clothes on her back, her mother's Bible, and the small pouch of coins she'd been saving since childhood for a future that suddenly seemed impossible to imagine. Her father, Robert Coleman, had made the arrangement with Hartwell 6 weeks earlier, presenting it to Sarah as a business transaction that would solve all their family's financial problems while providing her with the security of marriage to one of the territory's wealthiest men. "It's a good match, Sarah," he had told her that evening in September, his voice carrying the tone of a man who had already made an irreversible decision. "Hartwell owns more land than any man between here and Denver. You'll never want for anything, and the children will have opportunities we could never provide." But Sarah had seen Cornelius Hartwell's previous wives, 2 of them, to be precise. The first, Margaret, had died under mysterious circumstances after just 18 months of marriage, her body found at the bottom of a ravine on Hartwell's property, under conditions that the local sheriff had deemed accidental, despite evidence that suggested otherwise. The second, Anna, had lasted 3 years before disappearing entirely, her fate unknown but whispered about in the careful tones that frontier women used when discussing things too dangerous to speak of openly. The stories that circulated among the women of Cheyenne painted a picture of Cornelius Hartwell that had nothing to do With his public reputation as a successful businessman and everything to do with his private appetites for control, domination, and the kind of cruelty that thrived in isolation, Sarah had listened to these whispered warnings and made her decision accordingly, even though it meant abandoning everything familiar and fleeing into a wilderness that held its own deadly dangers. Now, standing on the banks of the Powder River, with her pursuers closing in and her body telling her that her baby would not wait much longer to make its entrance into the world, Sarah faced the consequences of that decision. The river was too deep and swift for her to cross in her condition. The terrain on either side offered no real concealment, and the approaching voices told her that her 3-day head start was about to come to an end. That's when she saw him, Joseph. Running Bear emerged from the morning mist like something out of the old stories his grandmother used to tell, moving with the silent grace that had made Arapaho warriors legendary across the plains. He was tall and lean, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of weathered features that spoke of years spent under the open sky and the intelligent eyes of someone who missed nothing about his surroundings. His clothing was a mixture of traditional buckskin and practical frontier wear, and the Winchester rifle in his hands was held with the casual competence of someone who had never needed to think twice about its use. For a moment, they stared at each other across 20 yards of rocky riverbank, each taking the measure of the other and trying to decide whether this unexpected encounter represented salvation or a new form of danger. Sarah's hand instinctively went to her belly, a protective gesture that had become automatic during her days of flight, while Joseph's dark eyes took in her obvious pregnancy, her exhausted condition, and the fear that she was trying desperately to conceal. "You're being hunted," he said finally, his English accented but clear, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that suggested he had been aware of her pursuers long before she had spotted him. "Yes," Sarah replied, abandoning any pretense that might have served her better under different circumstances. "They want to take me back to marry a man who kills his wives." Joseph Running Bear studied her face for several long seconds, perhaps searching for deception or evaluating the truth of her extraordinary claim. Behind them, the voices of the pursuit party were growing louder, close enough now that individual words could be distinguished from the general clamor of men and horses pushing hard across difficult terrain. "Your child comes soon," Joseph observed, his gaze noting the way Sarah unconsciously swayed with each contraction that rippled through her distended body. "Today, I think," Sarah admitted, no longer able to ignore the increasing frequency and intensity of the pains that had been building since before dawn. "Maybe sooner." The practical implications of this situation would have overwhelmed most people. A pregnant white woman fleeing from legal authority, an Arapaho warrior whose very presence in this area violated multiple territorial laws, and a pursuit party that included a federal marshal with the power to arrest both of them on sight. Any assistance Joseph provided to Sarah would make him a federal fugitive, while any attempt to return her to her pursuers would result in her forced marriage to a man she believed would eventually kill her. But Joseph Running Bear had spent 32 years learning to make difficult decisions quickly, and something in Sarah's desperate courage reminded him of his own sister, who had died defending her children from soldiers during the Sand Creek Massacre 23 years earlier. Some stands had to be taken regardless of the personal cost. Some innocents had to be protected even when protection seemed impossible, and some battles had to be fought even when victory appeared unlikely. "Come," he said, shouldering his rifle and extending his hand to help Sarah navigate the rocky slope that led away from the river. "There's a place where they won't find us." The place Joseph led her to was a hidden canyon about 2 miles northwest of the river, accessible only through a narrow passage between towering sandstone walls that would be nearly impossible to spot unless you knew exactly where to look. The canyon itself was perhaps 100 yards long and 50 yards wide, with a small spring that provided fresh water and enough grass to sustain a horse for several days. Most importantly, it could be defended by a single person with a rifle, making it the kind of tactical position that could hold off a much larger force indefinitely. Joseph had discovered this sanctuary 3 years earlier while tracking a wounded elk, and he had been using it as a base camp during his hunting expeditions into this part of the territory. A careful arrangement of stones concealed a cache of supplies that included dried meat, blankets, medical herbs, and the basic tools necessary for extended survival in the wilderness. It wasn't much, but it was far more than Sarah had possessed during her 3 days of desperate flight. As Joseph helped her settle onto a bed of buffalo robes near the spring, Sarah felt the first really powerful contraction grip her body with an intensity that made her gasp and double over in pain. The baby was coming, ready or not, wanted or not, in this hidden canyon with only an Arapaho warrior to assist in the delivery. "I don't know anything about birthing babies," Sarah said through gritted teeth as another contraction built to its peak. Joseph Running Bear smiled for the first time since she had met him, an expression that transformed his weathered features and revealed the warmth that his stern exterior had concealed. "My grandmother delivered more children than the white doctor in Cheyenne ever saw," he replied, already moving to build up the small fire that would provide warmth and light for what was to come. "She taught me things that might help if you're willing to trust me." Trust, it was such a simple word for such a complex decision. Sarah was about to place her life and her baby's life in the hands of a man she had known for less than an hour, a member of a people that her own culture had taught her to fear and mistrust, in a situation where the slightest mistake could result in death for both of them. But as another contraction reminded her that choice was no longer an option, she found herself nodding agreement to an arrangement that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. "Tell me what you need me to do," she said, and with those words, Sarah Elizabeth Coleman placed her fate and her child's future in the hands of Joseph Running Bear, beginning a partnership that would challenge everything both of them had been taught about their respective peoples, and ultimately reshape both their destinies in ways neither could have imagined. Outside the hidden canyon, the voices of the pursuit party grew louder as they spread out along the riverbank, searching for any trace of the pregnant girl who had vanished into the wilderness like morning mist. Marshall Williams was coordinating a systematic search that would eventually expand to cover dozens of square miles, while Cornelius Hartwell sat his horse with the patient fury of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted and had no intention of starting now. But inside the canyon, as Joseph Running Bear prepared for the most important delivery of his life, and Sarah Coleman gathered her strength for the trial ahead, a different kind of story was beginning. One that would prove that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources, that courage often looks nothing like what we expect, and that the bonds forged in moments of desperate need can prove stronger than all the artificial divisions that societies create to keep people apart. The baby was coming whether the world was ready or not, and everything that followed would spring from this single moment of trust between two people who should have been enemies but chose instead to become something far more powerful, allies in the fight to protect new life and preserve hope in a world that seemed determined to crush both. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The labor lasted 14 hours, beginning with the pale light of dawn and continuing through the scorching heat of midday into the cool embrace of evening. Joseph Running Bear had witnessed many births in his life horses, cattle, and the occasional human child during his years with the tribe, but nothing had prepared him for the intensity of bringing a baby into the world under these circumstances. With a woman whose courage seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour despite the ordeal she was enduring, Sarah's contractions had started coming regularly by mid-morning, forcing her to grip Joseph's hands with a strength that surprised them both. Between the waves of pain, she told him fragments of her story that painted a picture far more complex than he had initially understood. Her father wasn't just a desperate man making a poor decision for financial reasons. He was deeply in debt to Cornelius Hartwell, who had been systematically acquiring properties throughout the territory by extending loans that small ranchers and business owners couldn't possibly repay. "He owns half of Cheyenne already," Sarah gasped during a brief respite between contractions. "The general store, the grain mill, 3 of the saloons. Papa thought he could make enough from the boarding house to pay back what he borrowed, but Hartwell kept changing the terms of the loan. Every month, more interest. Every month, new fees. Until Papa had no choice but to accept Hartwell's offer for my hand." Joseph listened while preparing the traditional medicines his grandmother had taught him to gather from the canyon walls. Wailed sage for cleansing, willow bark for pain, and a dozen other plants that most white people dismissed as weeds, but which the Arapaho had used for generations to ease childbirth. His hands worked automatically, grinding herbs and preparing teas, while his mind processed the implications of what Sarah was revealing. Cornelius Hartwell wasn't just an abusive husband who collected wives like cattle. He was operating a sophisticated system of economic control that allowed him to acquire property, businesses, and even people through manipulation of debt and legal leverage. The arranged marriage to Sarah wasn't romance or even simple lust. It was the final step in taking possession of her father's boarding house and eliminating a potential witness to his business practices. As the afternoon sun reached its peak, painting the canyon walls in shades of red and gold, Sarah's labor intensified beyond anything either of them had expected. Joseph found himself drawing on knowledge that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious memory, his hands guided by instincts that his grandmother had awakened during his childhood, but which he had never needed to use until this moment. "The baby is positioned wrong," he said finally, his voice steady despite the gravity of what he was observing. "Breech birth. This will be more difficult." Sarah's face went pale, but her jaw set with determination that reminded Joseph of warriors he had known who faced impossible odds with nothing but their courage and their commitment to protecting what they loved. "What do we do?" "We trust in the old ways," Joseph replied, beginning the careful process his grandmother had described, but which he had hoped never to attempt. "And we trust in your strength." The hours that followed tested both of them beyond their limits. Joseph worked with the careful precision of someone who understood that a single mistake could cost 2 lives. Using techniques that white doctors would have dismissed as primitive, but which had been refined over generations of tribal midwives, who had brought children safely into the world under conditions far more challenging than any hospital could. Imagine. Sarah endured pain that seemed to exceed the boundaries of human tolerance, but she never lost her focus on the goal that had driven her to flee across the Wyoming wilderness. Her baby would be born free, whatever the cost to herself. Free from Cornelius Hartwell's ownership, free from the cycle of debt and control that had trapped her father, free to grow up in a world where children weren't treated as property to be bought and sold. As evening approached and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky above the canyon, Sarah's efforts finally bore fruit. Joseph felt the baby's position shift, then saw the tiny feat that announced a successful delivery was finally possible. Working together with perfect coordination, they guided the child through its final journey from the safety of the womb into the uncertain world beyond. The baby girl who entered the world that October evening under the vast Wyoming sky was perfect in every detail, from her dark hair to her small fists that immediately began grasping at the air as if trying to hold onto this new existence she had fought so hard to claim. Her first cry echoed off the canyon walls like a song of triumph, announcing to the universe that life had once again proven stronger than all the forces arrayed against it. Joseph placed the newborn on Sarah's chest, both of them weeping with exhaustion and relief and joy that seemed too large for their tired bodies to contain. In that moment, looking down at her daughter's face in the firelight while Joseph cleaned and cared for them both with the gentle efficiency of someone who understood the sacred nature of what they had just accomplished. Sarah felt a peace she had never experienced before. "What will you name her?" Joseph asked softly, wrapping the baby in soft skins that would keep her warm through the cool night ahead. Sarah looked up at the stars that filled the sky above the canyon, more stars than she had ever seen from the streets of Cheyenne. Brilliant points of light that seemed to promise infinite possibilities for a child born under their guidance. "Stella," she said finally. Stella Running Star Coleman. The name combined her own family heritage with a tribute to the man who had risked everything to help bring her daughter safely into the world, and to the circumstances that had made this birth unlike any other in the territory's history. Joseph nodded approval, understanding the honor being given to him and accepting it with the gravity it deserved. But even as they celebrated this miracle of new life, both of them knew that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. Somewhere beyond the canyon walls, Cornelius Hartwell and Marshall Williams were continuing their search for the runaway bride who had dared to defy both law and custom. They would not give up easily, and they had resources that could turn the entire territory against anyone who tried to help Sarah and her newborn daughter. The baby would need food, medical care, and permanent shelter that went far beyond what the hidden canyon could provide. Sarah would need time to recover from the ordeal of childbirth, while preparing for whatever confrontation awaited them when they finally emerged from hiding. And Joseph would need to decide how far he was willing to go in protecting this woman and child, who had become his responsibility through choice rather than obligation. As the fire burned low and the three of them settled in for their first night together as an unlikely family, Joseph Running Bear found himself thinking about his grandmother's stories of the old times, when warriors were measured not by the enemies they killed, but by the innocents they protected. Tonight, under stars that had witnessed the birth of countless generations, he had helped bring new life into a world that seemed determined to destroy anything beautiful or hopeful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new choices that would test everything he believed about honor, courage, and the price of doing what was right. But tonight, listening to the soft breathing of a mother and child who trusted him to keep them safe, Joseph Running Bear felt a purpose more profound than any he had known since the day soldiers had destroyed his village and scattered his people. To the winds, the baby was born free as Sarah had demanded. Now it remained to be seen whether that freedom could be protected in a world where powerful men believed they owned whatever they could pay for, and where the law itself had become a weapon in the hands of those who had the money to purchase its protection. In the distance, barely audible above the whisper of wind through the canyon, came the sound of horses and voices as the search party made camp for the night. They were closer than Joseph had hoped, more persistent than he had expected, and better organized than he had feared. The confrontation that would determine Stella Running Star Coleman's future was approaching faster than any of them were ready for. But for now, in this hidden sanctuary under the eternal stars, a miracle had occurred. Life had triumphed over death, love had proven stronger than law, and three people who should have been enemies had become something far more powerful, a family bound together by choice, courage, and the knowledge that some things are worth any sacrifice to protect. 3 days after Stella's birth, when the autumn morning broke cold and clear over the Wyoming plains, Joseph Running Bear made a discovery that changed everything about their situation. While scouting the canyon's perimeter for signs of the search party, he found fresh tracks that told a story more dangerous than anything he had imagined. The boot prints belonged to someone moving alone, someone who had approached their hidden sanctuary during the night and spent considerable time studying the narrow entrance before retreating back toward the main trail. But these weren't the heavy, military-style boots of Marshall Williams or the expensive leather footwear that Cornelius Hartwell favored. These were moccasins with steel plates riveted to the soles, the signature footwear of Marcus Stone, A half-breed tracker whose reputation for finding people who didn't want to be found had made him the most feared manhunter in 3 territories. Joseph had encountered Stone twice before, both times during his own people's desperate flight from reservation boundaries that seemed to shrink with each passing season. Stone was methodical, patient, and utterly without conscience when it came to collecting the bounties that white authorities placed on Apache, Sioux, and Arapaho who dared to live free on the lands their ancestors had roamed for countless generations. More importantly, Stone understood native tactics in ways that ordinary trackers never could, making him uniquely qualified to hunt someone like Joseph, who relied on traditional methods of concealment and evasion. Returning to the canyon where Sarah was nursing baby Stella by the morning fire, Joseph found himself facing a tactical problem that had no good solutions. They couldn't stay in the canyon much longer without risking discovery by someone who clearly knew they were in the area. But Sarah was still recovering from childbirth, and in no condition for the kind of hard travel that fleeing from Marcus Stone would require. The baby needed consistent warmth, regular feeding, and medical attention that couldn't be provided while constantly moving through wilderness terrain. "We have a new problem," Joseph said quietly, settling beside Sarah and examining the babies. "Face for any signs of distress." Stella was thriving despite the circumstances of her birth, but newborns were fragile in ways that could turn fatal without warning. Sarah looked up from nursing her daughter, immediately reading the concern in Joseph's expression. Over the past 3 days, she had learned to interpret the subtle changes in his demeanor that indicated shifting levels of danger or opportunity. This morning, she saw something she hadn't seen before: genuine fear. "What kind of problem?" Joseph described his discovery of Stone's tracks and explained what it meant to have attracted the attention of the territory's most successful manhunter. Stone worked exclusively for clients who could afford his substantial fees, which meant that Cornelius Hartwell had escalated beyond using local law enforcement and was now employing private resources that operated outside normal legal constraints. "This man Stone," Sarah asked, "what does he do when he finds his targets?" Joseph's hesitation told her everything she needed to know. Marcus Stone wasn't interested in bringing fugitives back alive unless specifically contracted to do so. His reputation had been built on efficiency rather than mercy, and dead fugitives created fewer complications than living ones, who might testify about the circumstances that had forced them to run. "He's been tracking us for at least 2 days, Joseph continued, "which means he knows approximately where we are, but hasn't yet pinpointed our exact location. We have perhaps 12 hours before he narrows the search enough to find this canyon." Sarah looked down at Stella, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms, completely unaware that her 3-day-old life was already being threatened by forces beyond anything a baby should ever have to face. The rage that filled Sarah in that moment was unlike anything she had experienced before, not the desperate fear that had driven her flight from Cheyenne, but a cold, focused anger at the men who would hunt a newborn child like an animal. "Then we leave," she said simply. "Now, before he gets any closer." But Joseph was already shaking his head. "You can't travel the distances we'd need to cover to stay ahead of him. Not yet. And the baby." He didn't finish the sentence, but both of them understood what he meant. Newborns died easily when exposed to the kind of hardships that serious wilderness travel demanded. "Then what do you suggest?" Joseph stared into the fire for several long minutes, weighing options that all seemed to lead toward disaster. Finally, he spoke with the careful precision of someone who had made a decision that terrified him, but which seemed to offer their only realistic chance of survival. "We stop running and start fighting." The plan Joseph outlined was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Instead of continuing to flee from their pursuers, they would use the canyon's defensive advantages to force a confrontation on their terms. The narrow entrance could be defended by a single person with a rifle, while the high walls provided protection from attack from above. Most importantly, The canyon's hidden location meant that any fight would happen away from witnesses who might complicate the story that emerged afterward. "You're talking about killing a federal marshal," Sarah said, understanding immediately what Joseph was proposing. "I'm talking about protecting a mother and child from men who have no legal right to hunt them like animals," Joseph replied. "Marshal Williams is operating outside his jurisdiction, pursuing a woman who committed no crime except refusing to marry a man who terrifies her. Stone has no legal authority at all. He's a paid killer working for someone who believes he can purchase whatever he wants, including human beings." The moral mathematics of their situation was complex, but ultimately clear. The law that Marshal Williams represented had become corrupted by the money and influence of men like Cornelius Hartwell, who used legal mechanisms to legitimize what amounted to slavery and abuse. Fighting back against such corruption wasn't rebellion, it was justice. Sarah found herself thinking about her mother, who had died when Sarah was 12, but who had taught her, daughter, that some principles were worth dying for: freedom, the right to choose your own husband, the right to protect your children from those who would harm them. Her mother had been a gentle woman who never raised her voice in anger, but Sarah remembered the steel in her eyes when she spoke about the responsibilities that came with being born free. "What would you need me to do?" Joseph's plan required Sarah to serve as bait, presenting herself at the canyon entrance in a way that would draw their pursuers into the narrow passage, where they could be confronted without the advantages of superior numbers or heavy weapons. It was dangerous in the extreme, requiring her to expose herself and her baby to direct confrontation with men who had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence to achieve their goals. But it was also the only strategy that offered any realistic chance of ending the pursuit permanently. As long as Marshal Williams and Marcus Stone remained alive and motivated to continue hunting them, Sarah and Stella would never be safe anywhere in the territory. They would spend their lives running from one hiding place to another, always looking over their shoulders, never able to build the kind of stable home that children needed to thrive. "I've been running for 6 days, Sarah said. "Finally, I'm tired of being afraid." The preparation took most of the day, with Joseph using skills learned during years of warfare against cavalry units that had superior weapons but inferior knowledge of the terrain they were fighting on. He positioned himself in carefully concealed locations that would allow him to control the canyon entrance while remaining invisible to anyone approaching from outside. He prepared backup positions in case the first confrontation went badly, and he cached supplies that would allow them to survive for several days if the fight extended longer than expected. Most importantly, he taught Sarah how to use the revolver he had taken from a dead soldier during the last battle his people had fought before being forced onto the reservation. It was a Colt .45 with enough stopping power to kill a man with a single well-placed shot, and Joseph made sure Sarah understood both its capabilities and its limitations. "You point, you squeeze, you don't hesitate," he told her as she practiced with the unloaded weapon. "If shooting starts, the person who hesitates is the person who dies." Sarah nodded, trying to reconcile the weight of the gun in her hands with her memories of helping her mother tend to injured birds and stray cats. Violence had never been part of her nature, but neither had childbirth in a hidden canyon with an Arapaho warrior serving as midwife. Circumstances had a way of revealing capabilities that people never knew they possessed. As the sun began to set on their 4th day in the canyon, painting the walls in shades of red and gold that reminded Sarah of the sunrise when Stella had been born, Joseph made one final check of their defensive preparations. Everything was ready. The confrontation that would determine their future would happen within the next few hours, and the outcome would depend on courage, skill, and the kind of luck that desperate people hoped for, but could never count on. "Are you ready for this?" Joseph asked, settling beside Sarah and her sleeping baby near the fire that would serve as a beacon to draw their enemies into the trap they had prepared. Sarah looked down at Stella's peaceful face, then up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky above the canyon. Somewhere out there, men with guns and badges and the conviction that money could purchase any outcome they desired were preparing to take away everything she had fought to protect. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. The attack came at dawn on their 5th day in the canyon, but not from the direction Joseph had anticipated. Marcus Stone had spent the night studying their defensive positions from the high mesa above, using field glasses to identify every possible approach and escape route before making his move. When he finally struck, it was with the kind of tactical precision that had made him legendary among those who hired his services. The first indication of danger came when Joseph's horse began showing signs of distress, pawing the ground and snorting nervously at scents carried on the morning wind. Joseph immediately moved to his primary defensive position near the canyon entrance, rifle ready and every sense alert for signs of the approach he had been expecting since finding Stone's tracks 2 days earlier. What he didn't expect was the sound of gunfire echoing from the mesa above, followed by the distinctive whistle of a bullet ricocheting off Stone just inches from where Sarah was feeding Stella by the morning fire. Stone had positioned himself 300 yards above them, using a long-range rifle to pin them down while a second group of attackers approached through the canyon entrance. "Get down," Joseph shouted, but Sarah was already moving, clutching Stella against her chest and diving behind the rock formation they had prepared as emergency shelter. The baby began crying at the sudden motion and loud noises, her wails echoing off the canyon walls and providing an audio beacon that would make concealment impossible. Joseph found himself facing the tactical nightmare he had most feared: enemies attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, using his own defensive preparations against him. The narrow canyon entrance that was supposed to protect them from superior numbers had become a trap that prevented escape, while the high walls that should have provided security had been turned into sniper positions by an enemy who understood the terrain better than Joseph had anticipated. The second volley of gunfire came from ground level, confirming Joseph's worst suspicions. Marshal Williams and at least 2 other men were advancing through the canyon entrance, using covering fire from Stone's elevated position to move closer to where Sarah and the baby were sheltering. In minutes, they would be close enough to end this confrontation with overwhelming firepower. But Joseph Running Bear had survived 3 years of guerrilla warfare against the United States Army by understanding that superior tactics could overcome superior numbers, and desperation could make even impossible odds manageable. Instead of trying to defend fixed positions that his enemies had already compromised, he began moving. The cache of supplies he had hidden throughout the canyon included more than just food and medical herbs. Joseph had also concealed several of the explosive devices that his people had learned to construct during their years of resistance. Crude but effective bombs made from black powder, metal fragments, and timer mechanisms salvaged from broken pocket watches. He had hoped never to use them, but hope was a luxury that desperate men couldn't afford. The first explosion came from the canyon entrance, where Joseph had placed his largest device in a position that would block the narrow passage while creating a debris field that would take considerable time to clear. The blast caught Marshal Williams and his men completely off guard, sending them scrambling for cover while filling the air with dust and smoke that provided Joseph with the concealment he needed to reach his secondary positions. Stone's response from above was immediate and professional. He shifted his fire to systematically target every location where Joseph might take cover, forcing him to keep moving while trying to work his way close enough to Sarah and Stella to provide direct protection. The tracker's rifle work was precise, enough to demonstrate that he could have killed Joseph at any point during the past few minutes, which meant he was deliberately keeping him alive for reasons that probably had nothing to do with mercy. "Running Bear," Stone's voice carried clearly from his position on the mesa. speaking English with the particular accent that marked him as someone who had grown up between cultures and never been fully accepted by either. "I know you can hear me." Joseph didn't respond, but he listened carefully while continuing to move through the smoke and chaos toward where Sarah was protecting their baby daughter. Stone's voice carried the confidence of someone who believed he held all the advantages in this confrontation. "Hartwell wants the woman and child alive," Stone continued. "You can walk away from this. Take your horse and ride out. No one has to die today." The offer was probably genuine, which made it even more insulting. Marcus Stone was suggesting that Joseph abandon a woman and baby he had sworn to protect in exchange for his own safety. It was the kind of bargain that men without honor might consider, but which revealed Stone's fundamental misunderstanding of the warrior code that had shaped Joseph's entire life. Instead of responding to Stone's offer, Joseph triggered his second explosive device, positioned near the spring where Sarah had been gathering water each morning. The blast created a cloud of steam and debris that provided additional concealment while destroying the sniper's clear lines of sight into the lower canyon. Joseph used the confusion to reach Sarah's position behind the rock formation, where he found her calm and focused despite the gunfire and explosions that surrounded them. Stella had stopped crying, perhaps lulled by the rhythm of her mother's heartbeat, or simply exhausted by the morning's traumatic events. "How many men?" Sarah asked quietly, checking the load in the revolver Joseph had taught her to use. "4. Maybe 5, Joseph replied, taking quick inventory of their ammunition and remaining explosive devices. "Stone is above us with a rifle. Williams and at least 2 others are at the canyon entrance, probably trying to find a way around the debris from the first blast." Sarah nodded, processing the tactical situation with the kind of quick intelligence that had enabled her to survive 6 days of wilderness flight while 8 months pregnant. "What do we do?" Joseph's answer surprised her. Instead of planning defensive maneuvers or escape routes, he began outlining an offensive strategy that would use their enemy's assumptions against them. Stone and Williams expected them to remain pinned down, waiting for rescue that would never come or surrender that would lead to death or recapture. They weren't prepared for the possibility that their quarry might attack. "I'm going after Stone," Joseph said simply. "He's the real threat here. Williams is just a federal marshal following orders, but Stone is a killer who won't stop until we're all dead. Remove him, and the others might be willing to negotiate." "How do you get to him?" "He's 300 yards above us on open rock." Joseph smiled grimly, the expression of a man who had spent years developing solutions to impossible tactical problems. "The same way my people have been surprising cavalry units for the past 50 years. I'm going to use their overconfidence against them." The plan he outlined was audacious enough to border on suicide, but it was also the kind of strategy that had enabled small bands of Arapaho warriors to defeat much larger forces by doing exactly what their enemies least expected. Instead of trying to climb the mesa face under direct observation, Joseph would use his remaining explosive devices to create enough chaos and confusion to mask his approach, then rely on traditional stalking techniques to get close enough to Stone to end the threat permanently. Sarah's role would be to maintain covering fire from their current position, making enough noise and movement to convince their attackers that both defenders were still pinned down behind the rocks. It required her to expose herself to considerable danger while Joseph was absent, but it was also the only strategy that offered any realistic chance of ending this confrontation in their favor. "If something goes wrong," Joseph said, preparing his weapons and explosive devices for the assault he was about to attempt, "if I don't come back, you take Stella and you run. Don't try to fight 4 men by yourself. Just run." Sarah met his eyes directly, her own filled with the kind of fierce determination that had carried her through childbirth under impossible circumstances. "Nothing's going wrong," she said firmly. "You're coming back. We're all going home together." Home. It was such a simple word for such a complex concept. Neither of them had a traditional home anymore. Joseph's people had been scattered by war and forced relocation, while Sarah had abandoned everything familiar to protect her daughter's freedom. But somewhere during the past 5 days, in this hidden canyon where they had delivered a baby and planned for war, they had created something that felt like family. Something worth fighting for. Something worth dying to protect. Joseph began his assault by triggering the third explosive device, positioned to create maximum confusion among the men trapped at the canyon entrance. As smoke and debris filled the air once again, he disappeared into the chaos like a ghost, leaving Sarah alone with her sleeping baby and the responsibility of keeping their enemies focused on the wrong targets while he attempted the most dangerous mission of his life. Above them on the mesa, Marcus Stone continued his patient rifle work, unaware that the prey he had been hunting was about to become the predator. The hunter was about to discover what it felt like to be hunted by someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Joseph, running bare, moved through the smoke and chaos like a spirit from the old stories, using techniques his grandfather had taught him during the years when the Arapaho still believed they could fight their way to freedom. Every step was calculated, every movement designed to remain invisible to enemies, who expected their prey to cower behind rocks, rather than strike back with the fury of cornered wolves. The ascent up the mesa face took him through terrain that would have been impossible for most men. But Joseph had spent his childhood learning to navigate cliff faces and rock formations that cavalry horses couldn't follow. His hands found holds that seemed impossible. His feet discovered purchase on stone surfaces that appeared smooth from a distance. Most importantly, he moved with the patience of someone who understood that speed meant death, while precision meant survival. Below him in the canyon, Sarah maintained the deception that both defenders were still pinned down behind the rock formation. She fired the revolver at irregular intervals, varying her position just enough to suggest movement, while never exposing herself long enough for return fire to find its mark. Between shots, she whispered softly to Stella, whose remarkable calm, in the midst of gunfire, suggested that some babies were simply born with the temperament for extraordinary circumstances. Marshall Williams and his men had managed to clear enough debris from the canyon entrance to advance closer to Sarah's position. But their progress was cautious and methodical. They had no way of knowing how many explosive devices remained hidden throughout the canyon, and the memory of the blast that had nearly killed them was still fresh enough to make every step forward feel potentially fatal. What none of them realized was that Joseph had positioned his remaining explosives not to defend the lower canyon, but to cover his ascent up the mesa face. The fourth device detonated just as he reached the halfway point of his climb, sending a shower of rock and dust cascading down the cliff, while drawing everyone's attention away from the direction of his actual approach. Marcus Stone's reaction to the explosion revealed both his professional competence and his critical weakness. He immediately shifted position to get a better view of the canyon floor, assuming that the blast indicated renewed defensive activity from his trapped quarry. What he didn't consider was the possibility that one of those targets was no longer in the canyon at all, but was instead approaching his position from behind with the silent determination of a hunter who had become the hunted. Joseph reached the mesa top just as Stone was adjusting his rifle scope to target what he believed was movement near Sarah's position. The tracker was lying prone behind a natural stone barrier, completely focused on the scene below and utterly unaware that death was approaching from behind with the soft footsteps of someone who had learned to walk silently across any terrain. A moment, Joseph paused to study his enemy. Marcus Stone was younger than he had expected, probably in his early 30s, with the lean build and weathered features of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. His equipment was expensive and well-maintained, from the custom rifle to the leather clothing that showed careful craftsmanship. Everything about him suggested competence, professionalism, and the kind of focused attention to detail that had made him successful in a profession where mistakes were usually fatal. But Stone also displayed the overconfidence that came from years of hunting prey that could only run and hide rather than fight back. He had positioned himself with excellent fields of fire toward the canyon, but he had given no thought to security from behind. His rifle was perfectly zeroed for long-range shooting, but his sidearm was still holstered and would require precious seconds to draw and aim if he was surprised at close range. Joseph drew his knife, a blade his grandfather had forged from steel taken from a cavalry saber during a battle that had become legend among their people. The weapon was perfectly balanced for throwing, sharp enough to penetrate leather and bone, and blessed by ceremonies that connected its use to the defense of family and tribe. As Joseph prepared to end Marcus Stone's life, he whispered a prayer in the old language, asking his ancestors to guide his hand and accept the soul of an enemy who had chosen to hunt innocent children. Stone's death should have been silent and instantaneous, but fate had other plans. A loose stone shifted under Joseph's foot just as he began his final approach, creating a sound barely louder than a whisper, but distinct enough to alert someone whose survival had always depended on hearing things that other men missed. Stone rolled away from his rifle and came up with his sidearm drawn in a motion so fluid it seemed like a single movement. Joseph's thrown knife passed through the space where the tracker's heart had been just a moment earlier, embedding itself in the stone beyond with a sound like breaking glass. "Well, well," Stone said, his pistol aimed at Joseph's chest from a distance of perhaps 10 feet. Joseph running bare. "I was wondering when you'd get tired of hiding behind rocks like a frightened rabbit." Joseph remained motionless, calculating distances and angles while keeping his expression neutral. Stone's gun was steady, his finger on the trigger, but he was talking instead of shooting, which suggested he wanted something more than a simple kill. "Hartwell's paying me $1,000 for the woman," Stone continued, "but he'd pay twice that for a live Arapaho warrior to make an example of. Seems like you people keep forgetting that the reservation is the only place you're allowed to exist. And you keep forgetting that some cages can't hold eagles," Joseph replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had already accepted that death might be the price of protecting what he loved. Stone smiled, the expression of a predator who enjoyed the fear of his prey. "Eagles? You're nothing but a relic from a dead culture, pretending to be something that the world doesn't need anymore. Your people lost. Your way of life is over. The sooner you accept that, the easier things will be for everyone." "Perhaps," Joseph said quietly. "But today, this relic is going to kill you." The words were still hanging in the air when Joseph moved, not toward Stone as the tracker expected, but sideways toward the cliff edge where his grandfather's techniques for fighting on impossible terrain would give him advantages that no white man's training could match. Stone's first shot went wide as Joseph disappeared over the edge of the mesa, using handholds and footholds that seemed to exist only in his imagination. Stone rushed to the cliff edge, pistol ready, expecting to see his enemy falling toward the rocks below. Instead, he found himself looking down at empty air while Joseph appeared behind him like a ghost, having used a narrow ledge to circle back to the mesa top through a route that should have been impossible for any human being to navigate. The fight that followed was brief but decisive. Stone was skilled with his weapons and experienced in combat, but he had learned to fight on level ground against enemies who followed conventional tactics. Joseph had been trained by warriors who understood that survival sometimes required doing things that seemed impossible, fighting in ways that defied normal expectations, and using the terrain itself as a weapon. When it ended, Marcus Stone lay motionless on the mesa top, his neck broken by techniques that his grandfather's grandfather had developed for killing enemies silently in their own camps. Joseph retrieved his knife and Stone's rifle, then began the descent back to the canyon where Sarah was still maintaining her Desperate defense against enemies who no longer had their most dangerous weapon. The climb down took longer than the ascent had required, partly because Joseph was carrying additional equipment, but mostly because he needed to approach the canyon floor without being shot by either Sarah or the remaining attackers. The tactical situation had changed dramatically with Stone's death, but Marshal Williams and his men didn't know that yet, which meant they were still dangerous in their desperation to complete a mission that had already claimed too many lives. Joseph used Stone's rifle to announce his return, placing a single shot into the rock formation where Williams and his men had taken cover. The bullet's impact point, impossible to achieve from any position inside the canyon, told them immediately that their sniper was no longer protecting their advance. "Williams!" Joseph called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls with the authority of someone who now held all the tactical advantages. "Marcus Stone is dead. Your best chance of leaving this canyon alive is to walk away now." The silence that followed stretched for several long minutes while Williams processed this new information and decided how to respond. Joseph used the time to position himself where he could cover Sarah's location while maintaining clear fields of fire toward the canyon entrance. From this position, he could see that Williams had lost at least one man during the fighting, probably to shrapnel from the explosive devices, and the remaining attackers were showing signs of the kind of demoralization that came from realizing their mission had become impossible to complete. Finally, Williams's voice carried back up the canyon, hoarse with exhaustion and frustration. "Running Bear, you're still a federal fugitive. Surrender now and I guarantee you'll be treated fairly." Joseph's laughter echoed off the stone walls, carrying a sound that was anything but humorous. "Marshal Williams, you've spent 5 days chasing a woman and baby across the wilderness. You've hired a killer to murder an infant. You've attacked people who were defending themselves against forced marriage to an abuser. Exactly what part of this seems fair to you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the explosions, highlighting the moral bankruptcy of a law enforcement system that had become a tool for wealthy men to acquire human property. Williams had wrapped his pursuit in legal language and federal authority, but stripped of those justifications, he was simply a hired gun working for a man who collected wives like cattle and disposed of them when they became inconvenient. When Williams finally responded, his voice carried the weariness of someone who had begun to understand that some victories came at a price too high to be worth paying. "What do you want, Running Bear?" "I want you to ride away," Joseph replied. "Take your men and go back to Cheyenne. Tell Cornelius Hartwell that Sarah Coleman and her daughter are under the protection of people who won't be intimidated by his money or his threats. Tell him that if he wants to pursue this matter further, he'll be dealing with consequences he's not prepared to face." The negotiation that followed established terms that neither side particularly liked, but which both could accept. Williams would withdraw his men and file a report stating that the fugitives had escaped into tribal territory, where federal jurisdiction was unclear. Joseph would ensure that no further violence occurred if the pursuit was permanently abandoned. Sarah and Stella would be free to build new lives somewhere beyond Hartwell's reach. As Williams and his surviving men began their retreat from the canyon, Sarah emerged from behind the rock formation carrying Stella, who had slept through most of the morning's battle with the serene indifference of someone too young to understand that her entire future had just been decided by violence and negotiation. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, looking up at the mesa where Marcus Stone's body lay cooling under the autumn sun. Joseph nodded, though he knew that their victory was only temporary. Powerful men like Cornelius Hartwell didn't give up easily when they were denied something they wanted, and the legal system that had supported Williams's pursuit would continue to exist long after this particular confrontation ended. But for now, in this hidden canyon where a baby had been born free and where courage had proven stronger than law, they had won something precious: the right to determine their own futures without Interference from men who believed that money could purchase anything, including human beings. The war wasn't over, but this battle was theirs. 2 weeks after the battle in the canyon, Joseph Running Bear made a discovery that shattered everything he thought he knew about their enemy and transformed their temporary victory into the opening move of a war that had been raging for decades. While scouting the abandoned Hartwell mining operation 15 miles north of their new camp, he found evidence that connected Cornelius Hartwell not just to Sarah's arranged marriage, but to the massacre that had destroyed Joseph's own family. 23 years earlier, the mining camp sat in a valley that Joseph remembered from his childhood, though it had been called by a different name then, Sweetwater Creek, where his people had gathered each autumn to harvest the wild berries that grew thick along the stream banks. Now it was scarred by machinery and littered with the debris of industrial extraction. But the bones scattered throughout the abandoned workings told a story that no amount of development could erase. Joseph had come here following information gleaned from Marcus Stone's personal effects, which had included detailed maps of mining claims, railroad routes, and what appeared to be a systematic survey of tribal burial grounds throughout the territory. What he found was worse than grave robbing or simple desecration. It was evidence of a coordinated campaign to erase all traces of his people's existence while profiting from the resources that lay beneath their sacred sites. Among the papers in Stone's saddlebags, Joseph had discovered correspondence between Hartwell and a man named Colonel Harrison Wade, the same officer who had led the cavalry unit responsible for the Sweetwater Creek massacre in 1864. The letters, spanning more than 2 decades, detailed a partnership that combined military authority with private enterprise to systematically eliminate native populations while claiming their land for mining and agricultural development. The massacre that had taken Joseph's parents, his sister, and 43 other members of his band hadn't been a military action motivated by frontier security concerns. It had been a business transaction designed to clear valuable mining territory of its inconvenient original inhabitants. The gold and silver that Hartwell had extracted from this valley over the past 20 years represented profits built on the bones of Joseph's family and friends. But the documents revealed something even more disturbing. Hartwell's current network of arranged marriages, debt manipulation, and property acquisition was simply the latest iteration of the same strategy he had been using for decades. He identified valuable resources, eliminated or displaced whoever controlled them, then used legal and financial mechanisms to claim ownership while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business practices. Sarah Coleman wasn't just another runaway bride. She was the daughter of Margaret Coleman, who had been Colonel Wade's translator and scout during the Indian Wars. Her father, Robert's boarding house, sat on property that contained one of the richest silver veins in the territory, a vein that geological surveys had identified, but which Robert remained unaware of. Hartwell's offer to marry Sarah had been motivated not by desire for a young wife, but by his need to acquire the Coleman property without arousing suspicion about its true value. Joseph returned to their new camp, a more comfortable shelter in the foothills where Sarah was recovering her strength and Stella was thriving with knowledge that changed everything about their situation. They weren't dealing with a simple case of domestic abuse or corrupt law enforcement. They were confronting a criminal enterprise that had been operating for decades, destroying lives and communities while building wealth through systematic murder and theft. Sarah was nursing Stella by the fire when Joseph arrived, but one look at his expression told her that whatever he had discovered would complicate their lives in ways they weren't prepared for. Over the past 2 weeks, she had begun to hope that their victory in the canyon might represent the end of their troubles, rather than just a temporary respite. "What did you find?" she asked, settling Stella in her cradle and preparing herself for news that would probably shatter the fragile peace they had been building. Joseph spread Stone's papers across the blanket where they had been sharing their evening meal, pointing out the connections that had taken him hours to fully comprehend. As Sarah read through the correspondence and examined the maps that documented decades of coordinated exploitation, her face grew pale with a combination of horror and rage that Joseph recognized because he had felt the same emotions during his own discoveries. "My mother," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "She never told me any of this. I thought she was just a translator, helping the army communicate with tribal leaders during peace negotiations. She was helping them plan attacks." Joseph replied gently, understanding that this revelation was devastating Sarah's memories of a woman she had loved and respected. But she may not have understood what the information was being used for. Wade was skilled at compartmentalizing intelligence, so that people could contribute to his operations without knowing the full scope of what they were enabling. Sarah studied a map that showed the locations of native camps, marked with dates that corresponded to cavalry raids that had claimed hundreds of lives. Her mother's handwriting was visible in the margins, noting details about seasonal movements, water sources, and defensive positions that would have been crucial for planning successful attacks. "She helped them kill your family," Sarah said, the weight of this connection settling between them like a physical presence. "Your people died because of information my mother provided." Joseph had been wrestling with this realization throughout his ride back to camp, trying to reconcile his growing feelings for Sarah and Stella with the knowledge that their family histories were connected by violence and betrayal that neither of them had chosen, but which they would have to live with. "Regardless, your mother was trying to survive in a world that gave her few choices," Joseph said finally. "Just like you were when you ran from the arranged marriage. Just like I was when I decided to help you instead of staying safely on the reservation. We all make compromises that we hope won't destroy the things we love." But Sarah was already shaking her head, her expression hardening with a resolve that Joseph recognized because he had seen it during Stella's birth and again during the battle in the canyon. When Sarah Coleman made up her mind about something, she pursued it with the kind of single-minded determination that made her dangerous to anyone who stood in her way. "This ends with us," she said firmly. "Whatever debts exist between our families, whatever wrongs were done by people who are dead now, they don't get passed on to Stella. She grows up free from all of this." Joseph nodded agreement, but he also understood that freedom would require more than simply declaring their independence from the past. Cornelius Hartwell was still alive, still wealthy, and still operating the same criminal enterprise that had been destroying lives for decades. As long as he remained in power, other families would suffer the same fate that had befallen the Colemans and the Running Bears. "There's more," Joseph said, opening the final folder that contained the most damaging evidence he had discovered. "Hartwell has been working with territorial officials to falsify mining reports and land surveys. The silver deposits on your father's property aren't just valuable, they're worth more than everything Hartwell currently owns combined. Enough money to control the entire territorial government and expand his operations into 3 neighboring states." The implications of this discovery were staggering. If Hartwell succeeded in acquiring the Coleman property, he would have the financial resources to corrupt law enforcement at every level, while extending his network of exploitation across the entire western frontier. The arranged marriage to Sarah had been just the first step in a plan that would ultimately affect thousands of people who had no idea their lives were being manipulated by forces beyond their comprehension. "What about my father?" Sarah asked. "Does he know about the silver?" Joseph shook his head. "According to these documents, Robert Coleman believes he owns a modestly profitable boarding house on marginally valuable land. Hartwell has been very careful to ensure that no accurate geological surveys reach anyone who might interfere with his acquisition plans." Sarah stood and walked to the edge of their camp, looking out across the valley toward the lights of Cheyenne. In the distance, somewhere in that growing frontier town, her father was probably sitting in his empty boarding house, wondering whether his daughter was alive or dead, and trying to figure out how to repay debts that had been deliberately designed to be impossible to satisfy. "We have to warn him," Sarah said finally. "Even if he doesn't believe us at first, he has the right to know what he's really dealing with." Joseph understood her desire to protect her father, but he also recognized the tactical problems that such contact would create. Robert Coleman was already under surveillance by Hartwell's people, and any attempt to reach him would expose their location while potentially placing him in even greater danger. "Warning him won't be enough," Joseph replied. "Hartwell has too much power and too many connections to be stopped by simple exposure. We need to do more than just inform people about his crimes. We need to gather enough evidence to destroy his entire operation." The plan that began to take shape during their conversation that evening was ambitious beyond anything either of them had attempted before. Instead of simply trying to escape from Hartwell's influence, they would actively work to dismantle the criminal network that had been destroying lives for decades. It would require them to infiltrate his organization, document his illegal activities, and build a case comprehensive enough to interest federal prosecutors who weren't already in his pocket. Most importantly, it would require them to split up for extended periods, with Joseph using his skills as a tracker and scout to gather intelligence while Sarah used her knowledge of Cheyenne's social networks to identify potential allies who might be willing to testify against Hartwell if they could be convinced that victory was possible. "This is dangerous beyond anything we've faced so far," Joseph warned as they refined the details of their plan. "If Hartwell discovers what we're doing, he won't just try to recapture you for an arranged marriage. He'll kill all of us to protect his operation." Sarah looked down at Stella, sleeping peacefully in her cradle without any awareness that her parents were planning to risk everything on a strategy that might end with all of them dead. For a moment, the weight of responsibility seemed almost overwhelming. They were contemplating actions that could orphan their daughter before she was even old enough to remember their faces. But then Sarah thought about all the other children who would grow up in a world where men like Cornelius Hartwell could purchase human beings like livestock, where families could be destroyed by debt manipulation and arranged marriages, where entire peoples could be eliminated to clear the way for mining operations and agricultural development. "Then we better make sure he doesn't discover what we're doing," Sarah said simply, and with those words, committed herself and her family to a war that would either end Hartwell's reign of terror or destroy them all in the attempt. The next morning, as they prepared to leave their peaceful camp in the foothills and begin the most dangerous mission of their lives, Joseph found himself thinking about his grandmother's stories of the old times, when warriors went into battle knowing that their actions would determine whether their people lived or died for generations to come. Today felt like one of those times when individual courage could reshape the world for everyone who came after. Whether that reshaping would lead to justice or destruction remained to be seen. But the choice to try had already been made by two people who had discovered that some fights were too important to avoid, regardless of the personal cost. 6 weeks after discovering the true scope of Hartwell's criminal empire, Sarah Coleman walked through the front doors of the Grand Palace Hotel in Denver, dressed in clothes that cost more than most frontier families earned in a year, and carrying documents that identified her as Elizabeth Morgan, widow of a wealthy railroad investor from San Francisco. The transformation was so complete that even Joseph, watching from across the hotel lobby, had to remind himself that the elegant woman commanding the attention of every man in the room was the same person who had given birth in a hidden canyon and fought beside him against federal marshals. The plan they had developed required Sarah to infiltrate Denver's high society, where Hartwell conducted his most important business and where the territorial officials who enabled his operations gathered to make deals that affected thousands of people across the western frontier. Joseph's role was to shadow her movements while conducting his own investigation into the network of corrupt officials, private investigators, and hired killers who made Hartwell's empire possible. The weeks of preparation had been intensive and dangerous. Using funds from Marcus Stone's hidden cash money that the tracker had earned by destroying other families, they had purchased the kind of wardrobe, documentation, and social credentials that would allow Sarah to move freely among the wealthy elite who controlled territorial politics. Joseph had used his tracking skills to locate and question several of Stone's former associates, gathering intelligence about Hartwell's organization that revealed its true scope and sophistication. What they had learned was both encouraging and terrifying. Hartwell's network included 3 territorial judges, 2 federal marshals, the territorial mining commissioner, and at least a dozen local sheriffs across 4 states. But it also included enemies, other wealthy interests who resented Hartwell's growing power, honest officials who had been marginalized by corruption, and victims who had survived his operations and might be willing to testify if they could. Be convinced that victory was possible. The Grand Palace Hotel served as the unofficial headquarters for the kind of business that couldn't be conducted in government offices or courtrooms. In its private dining rooms and exclusive salons, railroad barons negotiated with mining tycoons, territorial officials sold their influence to the highest bidders, and men like Cornelius Hartwell arranged deals that would reshape the map of the American West. Sarah's cover story was carefully constructed to appeal to Hartwell's specific interests. Elizabeth Morgan was allegedly seeking to invest the fortune left by her deceased husband in mining operations throughout the Rocky Mountain region, but she needed local partners with the kind of political connections that could protect her investments from regulatory interference. She had enough apparent wealth to be worth Hartwell's attention, but enough naivety about frontier business practices to seem like an easy target for manipulation. The bait worked perfectly. Within hours of her arrival at the Grand Palace, Sarah found herself invited to a private dinner hosted by Judge Harrison Mitchell, one of Hartwell's key allies in the territorial court system. The guest list included the mining commissioner, 2 railroad executives, and Cornelius Hartwell himself. The first time Sarah had seen her former intended husband since fleeing from Cheyenne nearly 2 months earlier. Hartwell had aged noticeably since their last encounter, his face showing the kind of stress that came from losing control of situations he had previously dominated. The failure to recapture Sarah and the loss of Marcus Stone had apparently created problems within his organization that went beyond the simple embarrassment of being defied by a 19-year-old girl. Other predators were circling, sensing weakness and preparing to claim pieces of his territory for themselves. "Mrs. Morgan," Hartwell said when Judge Mitchell introduced them, his eyes showing no recognition of the woman who had escaped from his arranged marriage. "I understand you're interested in mining investments. This territory offers opportunities that would astonish someone accustomed to California's more civilized business environment." Sarah smiled with exactly the right combination of sophistication and innocence, playing the role of a wealthy widow who understood money but not the violent realities of frontier enterprise. "Mr. Hartwell, your reputation precedes you. I'm told that you've managed to succeed where others have failed by understanding the unique challenges of developing resources in territories where federal authority is still evolving." It was a delicate way of acknowledging that she understood the need for extra-legal methods while maintaining enough ambiguity to avoid directly discussing criminal activities. Hartwell's responding smile suggested that he appreciated her discretion while recognizing a potential kindred spirit in the amoral pursuit of profit. The dinner conversation that followed provided Sarah with intelligence that exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Speaking among people they assumed shared their corrupt values, Hartwell and his associates discussed their operations with a frankness that revealed the full scope of their criminal enterprise. They talked about arranging accidents for problematic property owners, bribing federal officials to ignore mining violations, and coordinating with Army units to eliminate native populations that interfered with resource extraction. Most valuable was their discussion of the Coleman situation. which they treated as a temporarily frustrated business transaction, rather than Sarah's desperate escape from forced marriage. Hartwell revealed that he had traced Sarah and Joseph to the general vicinity of the foothills, but had decided to wait rather than launch another immediate pursuit. His new strategy involved allowing them to believe they were safe while he systematically eliminated their potential allies and escape routes. "The girl will surface eventually," Hartwell explained to Judge Mitchell. "Young mothers can't live indefinitely in the wilderness, especially with winter approaching. When she realizes that she has nowhere to run and no one willing to help her, she'll come back to negotiate. At that point, she'll be grateful to accept any terms I'm willing to offer." The casual cruelty of his assumption that desperation would eventually force Sarah to surrender herself and her daughter made her struggle to maintain her composure. But she also recognized the tactical value of this intelligence, knowing that Hartwell was playing a waiting game rather than actively hunting them provided opportunities that wouldn't exist if he was mounting an aggressive search. After dinner, as the group moved to Judge Mitchell's private study for brandy and cigars, Sarah found herself in conversation with Territorial Mining Commissioner Douglas Fletcher, a man whose corruption was so notorious that even Hartwell's associates spoke about it in carefully euphemistic terms. Fletcher had been drinking heavily throughout the evening, and his guard was lower than the others. "Mrs. Morgan," Fletcher said, settling beside her on an expensive leather sofa while the other men discussed railroad routes. "Hartwell tells me you might be interested in some properties that are coming available in the Cheyenne area. Very promising geological surveys, though there have been some complications with the current owners." Sarah maintained her innocent expression while encouraging Fletcher to elaborate. What she learned was that Hartwell's acquisition of the Coleman property was just one element of a much larger scheme to control mining rights throughout a region that contained some of the richest mineral deposits in the territory. A dozen other families were facing the same kind of debt manipulation and forced marriages that had threatened Sarah, all designed to transfer ownership of valuable land to Hartwell's network without alerting federal authorities to the true scope of the operation. "The beauty of the arrangement," Fletcher continued, his voice slurred but still coherent enough to reveal damaging information, "is that everything appears completely legal. Voluntary marriages, legitimate business transactions, unfortunate accidents that occasionally befall people who refuse to cooperate. Nothing that would interest federal prosecutors, even if they weren't already predisposed to support the development of territorial resources." As the evening progressed, Sarah gathered enough evidence to potentially prosecute half the territorial government for corruption, conspiracy, and multiple counts of murder. But she also became increasingly aware of the sophisticated nature of Hartwell's organization and the challenges they would face in exposing it. These men had been operating with impunity for decades, protected by wealth, political connections, and a legal system that they had purchased outright. The most disturbing revelation came near the end of the evening, when Hartwell mentioned his plans for expanding operations into neighboring territories. The success of his Colorado enterprise had attracted attention from similar organizations in other states, and they were coordinating efforts to create a regional network that would control resource extraction across the entire western frontier within 5 years, Hartwell said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged. "Every major mining operation between Denver and San Francisco will be connected to our organization. Federal authority is too weak and too distant to interfere with local arrangements, especially when those arrangements provide the kind of economic development that Washington wants to see." Sarah left the Grand Palace Hotel that night with intelligence that confirmed their worst fears about the scope of Hartwell's ambitions while providing the evidence they would need to build a case against him. But she also left with the knowledge that their enemy was far more powerful and well-connected than they had originally understood, and that defeating him would require resources and allies that they didn't yet possess. Joseph was waiting for her in their pre-arranged meeting location, a small church on the outskirts of Denver where they could speak privately without fear of surveillance. As Sarah related the evening's conversations, she watched his expression grow increasingly grim as he processed the implications of what she had learned. "We're not just fighting one corrupt businessman," Joseph said when she finished her report. "We're fighting an entire system that's been designed to enable this kind of exploitation. Even if we manage to expose Hartwell, there are dozens of others ready to take his place." Sarah nodded, understanding the magnitude of what they had committed themselves to attempting. But she also thought about Stella, sleeping peacefully in the hidden camp where they had left her with Joseph's cousin Mary, who had agreed to help care for the baby while her parents conducted their dangerous mission. "Then we better make sure our evidence is so compelling that it destroys the entire system," Sarah said firmly. "Because if we only wound it, it will heal stronger than before and come after our daughter with everything it has." The next phase of their plan would require them to contact federal authorities who might be trustworthy enough to act on the evidence they were gathering. But first, they needed to document the financial networks that made Hartwell's operations possible, which meant infiltrating the banks and investment firms that laundered his profits while providing the capital for expansion. It was a mission that would take them deeper into enemy territory than they had ever ventured before, requiring them to maintain their cover identities while gathering evidence from institutions that were protected by layers of security and legal privilege. One mistake could expose them to enemies who had unlimited resources and no compunctions about eliminating threats to their operations. But as they prepared to leave Denver and begin the next phase of their investigation, both Sarah and Joseph understood that they had already passed the point of no return. They had seen too much, learned too much, and committed themselves too deeply to the destruction of Hartwell's empire to consider any outcome except total victory or total defeat. The war they had declared in that hidden canyon 2 months earlier was expanding beyond anything they had imagined, but so was their understanding of what victory would require and what defeat would cost. Everything they loved hung in the balance, and the next moves would determine whether justice was possible in a world where money could purchase any outcome, including the silence of the dead. The telegram that changed everything arrived at the Denver Federal Building on a crisp November morning, carried by a courier who had ridden hard through 2 days of early snow to deliver intelligence that would either save or damn them all. Federal Prosecutor William Harrison read the encrypted message 3 times before summoning his most trusted investigator, trying to process information that seemed too extraordinary to believe, yet too detailed to dismiss as fiction. The message had come from Elizabeth Morgan, the mysterious widow who had been making waves in Denver's business community with her pointed questions about mining investments and territorial development. But the woman who signed the telegram identified herself as Sarah Elizabeth Coleman, and the evidence she claimed to possess would allegedly expose the largest criminal conspiracy in the history of the Colorado Territory. Harrison had built his reputation by prosecuting cases that other federal attorneys considered impossible, taking on powerful interests who believed their wealth and connections made them untouchable. But nothing in his 15 years of experience had prepared him for allegations that included systematic murder, large-scale bribery of territorial officials, falsification of federal mining reports, and the use of United States Army units to eliminate native populations for private commercial gain. "Sir," said Deputy Marshal Frank Morrison, Harrison's most experienced investigator, "we need to consider the possibility that this is some kind of elaborate trap. If even half of these allegations are true, we're dealing with people who have unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. They could be using this woman to lure us into making accusations we can't prove." Harrison understood Morrison's caution, but he also recognized details in the telegram that couldn't have been fabricated by someone without intimate knowledge of the territorial government's most closely guarded secrets. The woman claiming to be Sarah Coleman had provided specific names, dates, and financial transactions that aligned perfectly with irregularities Harrison had been noticing in territorial mining reports for the past 2 years. Set up a meeting, Harrison decided. But take every precaution. If this is legitimate, we're about to take on enemies who have been planning their defenses for decades. If it's a trap, we need to be ready for anything they might try. The meeting was arranged for the following evening at St. Mary's Cathedral, a location that offered both the sanctuary of holy ground and multiple escape routes if the situation turned violent. Harrison brought Morrison and 2 additional deputies, while Sarah arrived with Joseph Running Bear, whose presence immediately complicated the federal prosecutor's assessment of the situation. "Mrs. Coleman," Harrison said carefully, "I need to inform you that the man accompanying you is wanted on federal charges related to desertion from a United States Army unit. If this meeting proceeds, I'll be required to take him into custody." Sarah's response revealed both her intelligence and her understanding of the leverage she possessed. "Mr. Harrison, the evidence I'm prepared to provide includes documented proof that Army units have been used illegally to eliminate native populations for private commercial gain. If you arrest Joseph Running Bear before hearing what we have to say, you'll be protecting the same criminals who corrupted the military service he was trying to escape from." It was a calculated gamble that forced Harrison to choose between following standard procedure and potentially uncovering the kind of systematic corruption that could define his entire career. After a moment of consideration, he signaled his deputies to stand down while Sarah began presenting evidence that exceeded his most ambitious expectations. The documents she had gathered during her weeks of infiltration were extraordinary in their scope and detail. Financial records showing the movement of millions of dollars through territorial banks, with clear connections to mining operations that had been developed on land taken from displaced native populations. Correspondence between territorial officials and private mining interests that revealed the coordination of government policy with commercial exploitation. Most damaging were the personal journals and financial ledgers that Joseph had recovered from Marcus Stone's hidden caches, which documented years of payments for services that could only be described as systematic murder. "This material," Harrison said after reviewing several hours' worth of evidence, "represents the largest case of territorial corruption in federal history. If we can authenticate it and build supporting testimony, we could prosecute dozens of officials and potentially recover millions of dollars in stolen resources." But Sarah was already shaking her head, her expression indicating that she understood challenges Harrison hadn't yet considered. "Mr. Harrison, the people we're trying to prosecute own judges, federal marshals, and probably senators. They've been building their defenses for decades, and they have resources we can't match. Documentation alone won't be enough to convict them." Joseph stepped forward for the first time during the meeting, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent years fighting asymmetric battles against superior forces. "What Mrs. Coleman is saying is that you can't beat these people by following the same rules they've been breaking for 20 years. You need to force them to fight on ground where their advantages become liabilities." The strategy Joseph outlined was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Instead of trying to build a traditional prosecution case that Hartwell's network could corrupt or delay indefinitely, they would use the evidence to force a public confrontation that would expose the entire conspiracy to national attention. The key was making the story too big and too public for normal suppression tactics to work. "We arranged for simultaneous publication of this evidence in newspapers across multiple states," Joseph explained. "Not just the details of individual crimes, but the complete financial networks and political connections that make the operations possible. Once the information becomes public, Hartwell's people won't be able to silence witnesses or corrupt proceedings without confirming the very allegations they're trying to deny." Harrison understood the appeal of such a strategy, but he also recognized its dangers. If we go public before we're ready to make arrests, we give them time to destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses. These aren't people who hesitate to use violence when their interests are threatened. They're already using violence, Sarah replied firmly. Every day we wait, more families are being forced into debt slavery or arranged marriages. More native communities are being eliminated to clear mining territory. More resources are being stolen that should belong to the people of this territory. The question isn't whether action is dangerous, it's whether inaction is more dangerous. The debate that followed revealed the fundamental tension between legal procedure and moral urgency that would define their entire campaign against Hartwell's empire. Harrison was bound by federal regulations that required careful investigation, proper documentation, and coordination with territorial authorities, many of whom were compromised by the very corruption they were trying to expose. Sarah and Joseph were motivated by the knowledge that every day of delay meant more victims and stronger defenses for their enemies. The compromise they eventually reached reflected both the promise and the peril of their situation. Harrison would use federal resources to conduct an accelerated investigation, bringing in prosecutors and investigators from other territories who couldn't be influenced by Hartwell's network. Meanwhile, Sarah and Joseph would continue their intelligence gathering while preparing for the public revelation that would force a final confrontation. But the plan required them to take risks that went far beyond anything they had attempted before. Sarah would need to maintain her cover identity while getting close enough to Hartwell's inner circle to document his most sensitive operations. Joseph would have to infiltrate the network of hired killers and corrupt lawmen who enforced Hartwell's will through violence and intimidation. Most dangerously, they would both need to gather evidence from the military officials who had participated in the massacres that had destroyed native communities throughout the region. "There's something else you need to understand," Harrison said as the meeting concluded. "If this operation fails, if Hartwell discovers what we're doing before we're ready to act, you won't just be facing criminal charges or civil lawsuits. You'll be dealing with people who have made their fortunes by eliminating problems permanently. The federal government's ability to protect you will be limited, especially if they manage to corrupt or circumvent the legal processes we're trying to use." Sarah looked at Joseph, seeing in his expression the same determination that had carried them through every crisis since their first meeting at the Powder River. They had already risked everything to protect their daughter and expose the truth about Hartwell's crimes. Escalating that risk was simply the price of seeing their mission through to its conclusion. "Mr. Harrison," Sarah said finally, "we've been fighting for our lives since the day my daughter was born. The only thing that's changed is that now we're fighting for everyone else's lives too. If we succeed, we save thousands of people from the kind of exploitation we escaped from. If we fail, at least we'll have forced these criminals to reveal themselves publicly while trying to destroy us." Joseph nodded agreement, then added words that captured both the hope and the fatalism that had driven them from the beginning. "My people have a saying, better to die as wolves than live as dogs. We chose to be wolves the moment we decided to fight back instead of accepting what they wanted to do to us." The federal investigation that began the next morning would represent the last chance for justice within the existing legal system. If it succeeded, Hartwell's empire would be dismantled through proper legal channels, and its victims would receive compensation for decades of exploitation. If it failed, the final confrontation would take place outside the boundaries of law and civilization, in the same wilderness where their story had begun, with a pregnant woman fleeing from slavery and an Arapaho warrior choosing to help rather than turn away. As Harrison and his team began the complex process of building cases against dozens of territorial officials, Sarah and Joseph prepared for what they knew would be the most dangerous phase of their mission. They were no longer just fighting for their own survival or their daughter's freedom. They were fighting for the soul of a territory that was being torn apart by greed, corruption, and the kind of systematic evil that could only thrive when good people chose to remain silent. The final battle was approaching, and everything they had learned, everything they had endured, and everything they loved would be tested in a confrontation that would either establish justice or destroy any hope that such justice was possible in a world where money could purchase any outcome, including the silence of the dead. The betrayal came from the last person they expected, Deputy Marshal Frank Morrison, whose careful questions and apparent dedication to justice had earned their trust during weeks of coordinating the federal investigation. On a frigid December morning, as Sarah prepared to testify before a secret federal grand jury in Denver, Morrison's true loyalties were revealed in the most devastating way possible. The safe house where Sarah had been staying under federal protection was supposed to be known only to Prosecutor Harrison and his most trusted agents. But when Joseph arrived for their pre-arranged meeting, he found the building surrounded by territorial marshals led by a man he recognized from Marcus Stone's photographs, Deputy Territorial Marshal Thomas Clark, one of Hartwell's most reliable enforcers. Joseph watched from concealment as Sarah was led from the building in shackles, flanked by armed guards who treated her like a dangerous criminal rather than a federal witness. Her calm demeanor suggested that she had been expecting this betrayal, but her eyes searched the surrounding area until they found Joseph's hiding place, communicating through subtle signals the intelligence she had managed to gather before being captured. The trap had been more sophisticated than any of them had anticipated. Morrison had been feeding information to Hartwell's network throughout the federal investigation, allowing them to identify and eliminate key witnesses before they could testify. 3 of the territorial officials Sarah had documented were already dead, killed in accidents that left no evidence of foul play, but which effectively silenced their potential testimony. The financial records Joseph had recovered from Stone's caches had been dismissed as forgeries by territorial judges, who claimed the documents contained anachronistic details that proved they were fabricated. Most devastatingly, Morrison had provided Hartwell with the location of the hidden camp where baby Stella was being cared for by Joseph's cousin Mary. The federal investigation that was supposed to protect Sarah's family had instead delivered them directly into the hands of their enemies. Joseph arrived at the camp to find Mary wounded but alive, hiding in a root cellar where she had taken Stella when she spotted riders approaching through the forest. The baby was unharmed but terrified, crying with the intensity of someone who had sensed mortal danger, even if she couldn't understand its source. "They took her," Mary whispered, her voice weak from blood loss caused by a bullet wound to her shoulder. 10 men, maybe more, said they were federal marshals, but they moved wrong, acted wrong. When I asked to see their warrants, they started shooting. Joseph's rage at this moment was unlike anything he had experienced since watching soldiers destroy his childhood village. The men who had taken Sarah weren't just continuing their original pursuit. They were using the federal investigation to legitimize actions that amounted to kidnapping a federal witness. Under the cover of law enforcement, they could transport Sarah anywhere in the territory without fear of interference from local authorities. But Mary had managed to wound one of the attackers before being shot herself, and the blood trail they left behind told Joseph everything he needed to know about their destination. They were heading toward Hartwell's private compound in the mountains west of Denver, a fortified ranch that served as both residence and headquarters for operations that required complete secrecy. The compound was designed to be impregnable, with natural barriers that limited approach routes and artificial fortifications that could withstand assault by a much larger force. Hartwell had learned from the military campaigns against native populations, incorporating lessons about defensive positioning and fields of fire that made his stronghold nearly impossible to attack using conventional tactics. But Joseph Running Bear had been fighting impossible battles since childhood, and his years of resistance had taught him that conventional tactics were exactly what enemies like Hartwell expected their opponents to use. Instead of trying to assault the compound directly, Joseph began planning an approach that would use Hartwell's confidence against him while exploiting weaknesses that the cattle baron had never considered. The first step was contacting the Allies. They had cultivated during months of investigation honest territorial officials who had been marginalized by Hartwell's corruption, newspaper editors who were eager to expose the conspiracy, and most importantly, the other families who were facing the same kind of systematic exploitation that had threatened the Colemans. Robert Coleman, Sarah's father, had finally learned the truth about his daughter's flight and the forces that had been manipulating his debts to force the arranged marriage. Instead of the broken man Joseph had expected to find, he discovered someone whose rage at being deceived had transformed him into a formidable ally with connections throughout Cheyenne's business community. "I spent 2 months thinking my daughter was dead," Robert said when Joseph explained the situation. 2 months believing that my own weakness had driven her into the wilderness where she couldn't survive. Now I find out that every debt, every financial pressure, every impossible choice I faced was orchestrated by the same man who wanted to purchase her like livestock. The network of resistance that emerged over the following days represented every group that Hartwell's organization had victimized during decades of exploitation. Native families whose land had been stolen through fraudulent surveys, small ranchers who had been forced into debt slavery through manipulated loans, women who had survived arranged marriages to Hartwell's associates but had been too terrified to speak out until they learned that others were fighting back. Most surprisingly, the resistance included elements within Hartwell's own organization, hired guns, who had grown disgusted with the increasingly brutal methods required to maintain the empire, territorial officials who had been compromised through blackmail rather than greed, and business partners who had been planning their own moves against Hartwell's growing power. Joseph used these connections to gather intelligence about the compound's defenses and the timing of Sarah's interrogation, which Hartwell had apparently scheduled as a public demonstration of his power. Instead of simply eliminating a troublesome witness, he planned to extract information about federal investigation methods that could be used to corrupt future prosecutions. But the intelligence network that revealed Hartwell's plans also provided Joseph with opportunities that the cattle baron had never anticipated. The compound's strength as a fortress made it vulnerable as a prison. The same barriers that protected Hartwell from external attack would prevent him from escaping if those barriers were turned against him. The plan Joseph developed was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Instead of attempting a rescue mission that would likely fail against superior numbers and fortifications, he would orchestrate a series of simultaneous revelations that would expose Hartwell's entire network while trapping him in his own stronghold. Newspaper editors in 4 states had been provided with complete documentation of the conspiracy, ready for publication on a coordinated schedule. Federal prosecutors in territories outside Hartwell's influence had been given evidence that would allow them to issue warrants for dozens of territorial officials. Most importantly, the families and communities that had been victimized by Hartwell's operations were prepared to testify publicly about decades of systematic exploitation. The key was timing. All of these revelations had to happen simultaneously before Hartwell's network could coordinate suppression efforts or eliminate witnesses. Joseph had learned from his people's military campaigns that surprise was the most powerful weapon available to forces facing superior numbers and resources, but success would require him to infiltrate Hartwell's compound and ensure that Sarah was safe when the final confrontation began. The cattle baron was too intelligent and too ruthless to be taken alive if he realized that his empire was collapsing around him. Rather than face prosecution and public humiliation, he would likely eliminate all witnesses and attempt to escape with whatever resources he could salvage from the wreckage. As Joseph prepared for what he knew would be the most dangerous mission of his life, he found himself thinking about the night Stella had been born under the stars in that hidden canyon. Everything that had happened since that moment, the battles, the investigations, the betrayals, and the alliances had been leading toward this final confrontation, where the forces of exploitation and resistance would meet in a struggle that would determine the future of an entire territory. The child who had entered the world free would grow up in a world shaped by the outcome of the next 24 hours. Whether that world would be ruled by men like Cornelius Hartwell, or protected by laws that served justice rather than profit, would depend on the courage of people who had already risked everything for principles that couldn't be purchased with any amount of money. Joseph secured baby Stella with trusted allies who would take her far from the territory if the mission failed. Then began his approach toward Hartwell's mountain fortress where Sarah was being held prisoner. Behind him, across 4 states, newspapers were preparing to publish the story that would either liberate thousands of victims or seal the fate of everyone who had dared to challenge an empire built on systematic murder and theft. The final battle was about to begin, and this time there would be no hidden canyons to retreat to, no federal marshals to negotiate with, and no possibility of escape if courage proved insufficient to overcome the concentrated evil of men who believed their wealth made them untouchable. The assault on Hartwell's mountain fortress began not with gunfire or explosions, but with the sound of printing presses rolling across 4 states, carrying headlines that would reshape the American West forever. As dawn broke over the Colorado Rockies on December 15, 1887, newspapers from Denver to San Francisco published identical front-page stories exposing the largest criminal conspiracy in territorial history. Territorial government exposed AS. Criminal enterprise, screamed the Denver Post. Mining barons' empire built on murder and theft, declared the Salt Lake Tribune. Federal investigation reveals systematic genocide for profit, announced the San Francisco Chronicle. Within hours, telegraph lines carried the story across the continent, ensuring that Hartwell's network couldn't suppress the revelations through their usual methods of intimidation and bribery. Inside his mountain compound, Cornelius Hartwell. Read the headlines with the cold fury of a man watching his life's work collapse in real time. The newspapers contain details that should have been impossible for outsiders to obtain: financial records, correspondence with corrupt officials, and most damaging of all, first-hand testimony from victims who had been presumed silenced forever. Sarah Coleman sat in the compound's makeshift jail, listening to Hartwell rage at his subordinates while she processed information that would have been encouraging if her situation hadn't been so desperate. The public exposure was working exactly as Joseph had planned, but she was trapped in the headquarters of a criminal empire whose leader was rapidly running out of options that didn't involve eliminating witnesses. 20 years, Hartwell shouted at his assembled lieutenants, his voice carrying through the compound's wooden walls. 20 years of careful planning, perfect execution, and absolute control. And now some half-breed tracker and a runaway bride have destroyed everything because none of you could handle one simple recapture mission. The men receiving this tirade included some of the most feared killers in the territory, but Hartwell's rage had reached levels that made even hardened criminals nervous. They had followed him because his operations were profitable and because his protection seemed absolute. Now, with federal warrants being issued for dozens of territorial officials and their own names appearing in newspaper exposes, that protection was evaporating faster than morning mist. Joseph, running bare, approached the compound through terrain that had been considered impassable by the men who designed its defenses. Using techniques his grandfather had taught him for moving through enemy territory, he navigated cliff faces and rock formations that allowed him to observe Hartwell's stronghold from positions that the guards had never thought to watch. What he saw confirmed his tactical assessment. The compound was indeed impregnable against conventional assault, but it was also a trap for anyone inside who needed to escape quickly. The same narrow approaches that protected Hartwell from attack would prevent him from fleeing if those approaches were blocked by even a small force. Joseph wasn't planning a conventional assault. The allies he had coordinated were already in position throughout the surrounding mountains, not to attack the compound, but to ensure that no one could leave it alive. If they tried to escape with evidence that could incriminate surviving members of the network, the real attack would come from within. Using intelligence that Sarah had gathered during her weeks of infiltration, and allies that Hartwell had never suspected existed within his own organization, Thomas Clark, the deputy territorial marshal who had led Sarah's capture, approached her cell as the morning sun climbed higher over the mountain peaks. His expression carried none of the professional detachment she had seen during previous encounters. Instead, she saw the desperation of a man who realized that his decades of service to Hartwell's empire had made him a liability rather than an asset. "Mrs. Coleman," Clark said, his voice lacking the authority that had characterized their earlier interactions. "Mr. Hartwell wants to discuss terms for your release." Sarah almost laughed at the absurdity of the suggestion. "Terms, Marshal Clark? By now federal warrants have been issued for half the territorial government, including you. Hartwell's empire is finished, and everyone associated with it is going to federal prison or worse. What terms could he possibly offer that would matter?" Clark's response revealed the depth of Hartwell's desperation and the dangerous unpredictability of cornered predators. He's prepared to provide evidence against everyone else in the organization in exchange for immunity and safe passage out of the territory. He says you're the only person who can convince the federal prosecutors to accept his cooperation. The offer was both tempting and terrifying. Hartwell's testimony could indeed convict dozens of corrupt officials and expose criminal networks throughout the Western territories. But it would also allow the architect of decades of systematic murder and exploitation to escape justice while his subordinates paid the price for crimes he had ordered. "Tell Mr. Hartwell," Sarah said finally, "that I'm willing to discuss his proposal. But the discussion takes place outside, under the open sky, with his entire organization present to hear whatever deal he's offering." Clark understood immediately what Sarah was requesting: a public confrontation that would prevent Hartwell from eliminating witnesses after extracting whatever concessions he could negotiate. It was the kind of arrangement that criminals like. Hartwell never agreed to, which meant that Sarah was essentially rejecting his offer while maintaining the appearance of negotiation. But Clark also recognized that he had no choice but to relay the message. With federal warrants being issued and newspaper exposures destroying their political protection, Hartwell's organization was fragmenting rapidly. Men who had been loyal for decades were beginning to consider their own survival rather than continued allegiance to a leader whose empire was collapsing. The confrontation that followed brought together all the forces that had been building throughout the Colorado Territory for months. Hartwell emerged from his compound flanked by the remnants of his organization, perhaps 20 armed men who represented all that remained of a criminal empire that had once controlled territorial politics from Cheyenne to Denver. Sarah walked out to meet them with her hands unbound, her bearing straight and proud despite weeks of captivity and interrogation. Behind her came Joseph Running Bear, moving with the silent confidence of someone who had spent his entire life preparing for moments when courage would be tested against impossible odds. But they weren't alone. As the sun reached its zenith above the mountain peaks, figures began emerging from concealment throughout the surrounding forest. Robert Coleman led a group of Cheyenne business leaders whose properties had been targeted by Hartwell's debt manipulation schemes. Mary Running Bear, despite her wounded shoulder, brought representatives from 3 tribes whose lands had been stolen through the massacres that Hartwell had orchestrated with military cooperation. Most importantly, federal prosecutor William Harrison arrived with a force of deputy marshals from outside the territory, men whose loyalty hadn't been compromised by decades of bribery and intimidation. The warrants they carried represented the legal authority to arrest every person associated with Hartwell's organization, while the evidence they had compiled guaranteed convictions that even corrupt judges couldn't overturn. "Cornelius Hartwell," Harrison announced, his voice carrying across the mountain clearing with the weight of federal authority. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, murder, fraud, and treason against the United States government. You and your associates will surrender immediately or face the consequences of resisting federal authority." Hartwell's response revealed both his arrogance and his fundamental misunderstanding of how completely his world had changed. Instead of recognizing the hopelessness of his situation, he attempted to negotiate from a position of strength that no longer existed. "Prosecutor Harrison," Hartwell called back, "I'm prepared to provide testimony that will convict dozens of territorial officials in exchange for immunity and safe passage. The evidence I possess will revolutionize your understanding of how business is conducted in developing territories." Harrison's reply was immediate and uncompromising. "Mr. Hartwell, the evidence we already possess is sufficient to convict you and your entire organization without any cooperation from you. Your only choice is between surrendering peacefully or resisting arrest, which will add federal charges to the territorial crimes you've already committed." The standoff that followed lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but it felt like hours to everyone present. Hartwell looked around at the forces arrayed against him: federal marshals with legal authority, armed citizens with moral justification, and most damningly, members of his own organization who were clearly calculating whether their loyalty was worth dying for. The end came not with violence, but with the quiet dignity of justice finally asserting itself. One by one, Hartwell's lieutenants laid down their weapons and stepped away from their leader, choosing surrender over suicidal resistance. Even Thomas Clark, who had served Hartwell faithfully for over a decade, eventually recognized that the empire he had helped build was finished. Hartwell himself held out until the very last moment, his pistol drawn and his eyes wild with the rage of someone watching absolute power dissolve into complete helplessness. But when he finally looked around and saw that even his most loyal followers had abandoned him, he let the weapon fall from his hands and sank to his knees in the mountain snow. The trials that followed lasted through the spring of 1888, resulting in convictions that reshaped territorial law enforcement and established precedents for prosecuting systematic corruption. Hartwell himself received a life sentence without possibility of parole, while his subordinates faced various terms that reflected their level of participation in decades of criminal enterprise. But the real victory wasn't measured in prison sentences or recovered property, it was measured in the lives that would be lived freely because a pregnant girl had chosen to run rather than submit, and an Arapaho warrior had chosen to help rather than turn away. Sarah Coleman eventually returned to Cheyenne with her daughter, where she established a school for children from mixed families, native and white, legitimate and adopted, wealthy and poor. The school operated under a simple principle that had guided her through every crisis. All children deserved protection, education, and the chance to determine their own futures, regardless of the circumstances of their birth. Joseph Running Bear became the territorial marshal for the region, using his understanding of both native and white justice systems to bridge communities that had been deliberately kept in conflict by men like Hartwell. His reputation for fairness and courage made him legendary throughout the territory, but he always insisted that his greatest achievement was helping to deliver a baby under the stars and watching her grow up free. Stella Running Star Coleman grew up knowing her complete history, the courage that brought her into the world, the sacrifices that kept her safe, and the price that others had paid to ensure that she could choose her own destiny. She became a lawyer, dedicating her career to protecting families from the kind of systematic exploitation that had threatened her own parents. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the family gathered around their fire, Joseph would sometimes tell Stella stories about the old times, when warriors were measured not by the enemies they killed, but by the innocents they protected. And Sarah would add her own stories about the new times, when ordinary people could stand up to seemingly impossible evil, and win victories that changed the world for everyone who came after. The stars that had witnessed Stella's birth continued to shine over the territory, but now they looked down on a land where children could be born free and grow up safe, where families could build futures without fear of powerful men who believed human beings could be bought and sold like livestock. It had taken courage, sacrifice, and the kind of love that refuses to accept injustice even when fighting back seems impossible. But in the end, under those eternal stars, freedom had proven stronger than fear, and hope had overcome the darkest forces that money could purchase. The territory would indeed remember what happened when a pregnant girl ran from an arranged marriage, and an Arapaho warrior chose to help her deliver her baby under the stars. But the story they told was no longer about a single act of courage. It was about the transformation of an entire society, when enough people decided that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.